today we come together, as we do every year, to honor the life and work of Daniel Pearl. As many of us know, Daniel Pearl was brutally murdered 17 years ago while working as a foreign correspondent. A free and active press has been an essential part of our democracy since our founding. As a journalist, Daniel devoted his life to seeking truth about the world we live in, and he risked and ultimately gave his life to bring that world to us. Today, we remember his work and we honor his legacy. We're fortunate to have with us as our 2019 Daniel Pearl Memorial Lecturer, one of the world's great journalists, someone CBS News once called the best reporter of our time and maybe the best reporter of all time. Bob Woodward has been our nation's preeminent political reporter for over 4 decades. But before we get to hear from him, as many of you who have been to this before know, we have a few preliminaries. So first, I want to thank our partners, the Daniel Pearl Foundation, the UCLA Hillel, and the University Religious Conference. We'll begin with a few remarks from Rabbi Aaron Lerner of UCLA Hillel. 1 second. But I like the speed that you're showing. Following the rabbi, Judea Pearl, Daniel's father and an emeritus professor here at UCLA of computer science, will say a few words of remembrance. After Judea speaks, I will come back up and I will introduce Mayor Eric Garcetti. Mayor Garcetti will give Bob Woodward a proper LA welcome. Bob Woodward will then give his remarks. And at the end of that, he and I will sit in those chairs and have a conversation. So again, I thank you all for coming. Rabbi?
So I know how important it is for this event to run on time, so I have exactly 432 words to say. First of all, thank you. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here this evening, both on behalf of Hillel at UCLA and the University Religious Council. As both a rabbi and a representative of the interfaith community here on campus, I'm happy to share a word of optimism with you about what's happening here at UCLA. So first of all, contrary to popular belief, we are seeing on campus a resurgence of dialogue and relationship building right here. Both internally and within our identity groups and in the interfaith space, we're seeing a real hunger for people, students, to learn about one another, to connect with the other. Rather than succumbing to polarization and demonization, the students are actually engaging by the thousands and thousands and thousands of conversations all over campus. And that includes on the hardest topics, oftentimes politics and religion. While the blogosphere wants to convince you otherwise, their stories tend to focus on a tiny fraction of students who are sometimes either the most obdurate or loud voices on campus, but generally, it's worth knowing that students are engaged in lots of healthy conversations. So that's optimistic, and that's always where I want to start. On the challenging side, we're also seeing a general disinterest in truth. Fact-checking is out, narrative is in, reading full articles is out, headlines are in, digesting diverse media and perspectives is out, algorithms which tell me more about my own perspective are in. As both a religious leader and simply a concerned citizen, I'm perplexed as I watch scandal after scandal seem to disappear without consequence. Watching Spotlight, one is led to believe that uncovering a lie and exposing it in print will be disastrous. But it seems that for several decades now, the idea that truth is in the eye of the beholder has eroded both religious values and the power of journalism to keep our leaders accountable. So optimistically, I hear rumblings in educational circles about fixing this, things like using evidence to make more informed decisions, or teaching our students to tell the difference between fake news and what's real. Pessimistically, however, I see the credibility of both responsible media outlets and traditional moral values reduced to irrelevant relics of an age when people cared more about truth than winning. All of that is, of course, my way of introducing Judea Pearl. Professor Pearl is a rock of insistent rationality amidst an ocean of relativism. His popular work forces us to look through reason-based lenses at causality, and personally, you have demanded truth from me and from others, even when it may be unpopular, and even when there may be negative consequences. Judea models for us both a sparkling optimism and a moral foundation that reflects the values of both his ancestry and UCLA. So without further ado, Professor Pearl.
Thank you, Rabbi Lerner, for your kind words. And thank you all for being here with us. I see colleagues, I see students, I see supporters of the Daniel Pearl Foundation, and I see members of the UCLA community for whom this event has become cultural landmarks of shared values and shared aspirations. And I should also thank the Berkeley Center for taking care of the latest challenge of sending you our invitation when we were under a heavy and vicious cyber attack. So if you didn't get your invitation in time, forgive us, and thank Alexandra and Odessa for doing whatever was possible. Friends, 121 years ago, on January of 1898, the city of Paris woke up into the sight of a provocative headline on its newspaper stands. It had only one word there, j'accuse, which is French for I accuse. And it became the most famous front page in the history of journalism. People my age or older would suddenly remember this front page as the Émile Zola's open letter to the President of the Republic, accusing the government and the military for a major cover-up and a travesty of justice in the case of Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish officers who was falsely accused for treason and then sentenced to solitary confinement for life in Devil's Island. This front page saw the birth of something the world has not seen before and something that our modern world takes for granted: the power of the press to galvanize public opinion and shape public opinion. The reason I bring it up, this old story, is to place our lecture tonight in the proper historical perspective and welcome our speaker, Bob Woodward, who perhaps more than anyone else in our generation embodies the ideas of using the power of the press to galvanize and shape public opinion, to expose cover-ups, and to keep government honest. I'm so glad he had a chance to meet tonight with students, especially students from the Daniel Pearl Magnet High School for Journalism and Communication, who was ranked upper 4% in the nation last year. It's very important for students to meet face-to-face with a person who exemplifies and symbolizes the very principles and commitments that they are trained to uphold. Daniel was not driven by the thrill of exposing corruption and keeping governments honest. He preferred to write about the ocean of humanity that he discovered on planet Earth, which for him was an inexhaustible fountain of stories and magic and miracles largely unknown to us. Yes, he had 2 or 3 major scoops, like finding that the cruise missiles that President Clinton launched on Khartoum did not land in a weapon factory, but in a pharmaceutical factory, or that Al-Qaeda finances its operation by mining Tanzanite gems on the slope of Mount Kilimanjaro. But his real thrill was those quirky stories which appeared on the middle column of the Wall Street Journal, and through those A-heads, we learned how sturgeons are turned into caviar on the banks of the Caspian Sea, and how and why Yemen and Ethiopia cannot agree on who owns the real Queen of Sheba, and how Iranian housewives are weaving the largest carpet in the world, the size of a football field. From Doha, he wrote to us after befriending pearl divers, singers, American blues can make you sad. Russian songs can make you suffer. Pearl diving songs can make you go blind. And from Eritrea, he wrote, today I discovered my African roots. So many people are named Daniel. So many have a Jewish nose. And so many are absent-minded. So gulf of differences separates Watergate from Eritrea in Yemen, and yet the religion of truth bonds journalists into one unbreakable family of comradeships and mediates reality to us and serves as our moral compass. Thank you, Bob, for honoring our special son with your lecture tonight, and for everything you and your journalist communities are doing to keep his legacy alive. Thank you.
So, now my pleasure to welcome back to UCLA the mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti.
Good evening, Los Angeles, and when we greet Los Angeles, we greet the world, not only because of the flags here, but growing up here in Los Angeles, I always used to say you see the face of the world on the streets of LA, and as I think for Daniel probably too, growing up in Los Angeles, when you leave Los Angeles, you see the face of LA on the streets of the world. It prepares you for any place and anything. And thank you, Judah, for your amazing and personal testimony to the man that we celebrate here tonight. Thank you to UCLA and to Rabbi Lerner and UCLA Hillel. Thank you to the foundation for hosting this each year, and I've been able to come to many of these lectures. And thank you to Cal for your leadership as well throughout. Is that off? I'll just project. And thank you, Cal, as well, and everything you've done to make sure that a story didn't end 17 years ago, but that a story continues to be written by this room, by your family, by a legacy that continues to inspire us at a moment when we need hope more than ever. I've come to these lectures in the past because of the important voices that come to the table, the different perspectives, the critical thinkers which we need to hear. But I've also, on a personal level, since meeting the Pearl family, felt a connection to Daniel Pearl. Two Jewish kids from Encino. He went to Birmingham, where half of my friends in the neighborhood went, both interested in not just the San Fernando Valley, and we're talking about the old San Fernando Valley, like the real Galleria, not the old, the fancy one that's kind of been built in its place, but Valley Girls and Encino Little League and all the things that, when we first talked, really emotionally connected me. And that we both sought to see the world, that which connected him with journalism and connected me with public service. And a few years after his passing, when you came to visit me, when I was serving as the city council president, we talked about a new effort to rename part of Birmingham, your son's alma mater, as the Daniel Pearl Magnet High School, with that focus on journalism and communications to continue to write those urgent and beautiful stories that Daniel did, something I immediately supported. Because we know that here in Los Angeles, maybe even here, with one of those students who attends that school or one of the UCLA students, the next Daniel Pearl is ready, and the next Bob Woodward is ready to write her story or his story. The stories that are so critical to a democracy and to our collective memory as human beings. We often lionize political leaders, artistic leaders, scientific innovators. These are the ones that we hear have moved humanity forward. The generals and admirals who win wars, the person who learned to split an atom. But just as important and much less lionized are those who dare to speak truth and to make sure that our narratives aren't just fantastical, but are rooted in the truth of a given moment. That's what journalists do, in America and anywhere else in the world, what they must continue to do. At a time when so much is under attack, from our climate to our Constitution to even our conception of the idea of shared truths, journalism is more important than ever. When journalists themselves, as we experienced 17 years ago, can be enemies, but increasingly are being seen and even described as enemy of the people, told that they are creating news that is not real with fake news, all of us know that it isn't just journalists under attack, it is our democracy. I'd like to lionize the man who is going to come before us, because America's book of history could not be written without him. Not only as a participant in moving democracy forward, but in sharing those stories from behind the scenes. You see, in a college class or a high school class of American history, a textbook is very easy to flip through. It seems all easy and automatic that on page 65, slavery just ends one day. And on page 95, women get the right to vote. And then suddenly, World War II is won on page 105. Farm workers and civil rights workers are in the later chapters. Page 185, suddenly marriage equality happens. But wars that we fight, impeachments that we have faced, those stories that have been the underpinnings of this country have to be written by human beings. And human beings have to have the skill, the talent, and the judgment to piece together what they hear into a narrative that tells us the truth. That's who Bob Woodward is. I don't want to introduce him with a resume, you know it. One of his books would have been a great contribution to America. 2 would have been extraordinary. But that we have benefited from generation after generation of works that tell us how our democracy functions means that he has been an essential part of democracy, as great as any president that we have had, to keep public servants honest and accountable, to keep public debate robust and rich, and most of all, to make sure that we still have the signature of what is today a healthy and open society, but as you will hear from him, faces perhaps one of its greatest threats ever. So thank you for standing and speaking when folks tried to silence you. Thank you for what you have done to always go into those halls of power to tell the American people how our government is working. And from the moment that you broke the story in Watergate, probably the most important story of all time for our democracy in our lifetimes, to the commentaries you have done for every successive president. We have seen who we are reflected in the pages of your books, and we are so pleased to have you here. You're working for the Washington Post, which reminds us in its masthead that democracy dies in darkness. You are indeed a ray of light, and one of the brightest that we have. Few have done more to bring democracy into light than our speaker tonight, and it's my pleasure to welcome the great Bob Woodward.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to Danny's family, which is here. And I did not know Danny Pearl, never met him, but I had the great pleasure recently of reading his book that the Wall Street Journal put together of his articles, and the book is called At Home in the World. And you read these stories, and they are dazzling. He was a great reporter, a citizen of the globe, somebody who talked to strangers, talked to everyone, had this go-to-the-scene style of reporting. One story, 2001, in Anjar, India, where there had been a massive earthquake. Danny began his story this way: what is India's earthquake zone really like? It smells. And then thousands of bodies were here, and he finds a worker, and the worker says to him, come closer, come closer. You can see the hand of the victim of this earthquake here. And as I read that, I realized that in many ways that is the motto of journalism. Come closer, come closer. Bring the subjects of whom you are writing about or reporting on for television or radio closer and closer. Danny was a master of detail, showing the reporter's presence at the moment is the authority. It was in Kosovo in 1999, Tehran, 1993, 1996, writing about music in Doha, Qatar. In 1994, he wrote about the missing Stradivarius violin in this city, Los Angeles. And one of his co-writers at the Wall Street Journal said of Danny, he would continue reporting a story virtually up until the moment it appeared in the paper. I read that and it reminded me of Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was always pushing the deadline and would go back and rewrite stories. And I remember once asking Carl, I said, why do you do this? And he said, gave the obvious answer, there is more to know. We never know enough, and we have other people to talk to. Danny in 2001 was writing about gems in Tanzania. 1998 was in the Sudan, Saudi Arabia. 1996, he wrote a terrific story for the Wall Street Journal about the British tabloids, and the headline said, almost apologetically, the rags were right, that the tabloids got the story of the breakdown of the marriage between Princess Diana and Charles much earlier than the straight press. He did a story from Atlanta about General Sherman, who was the general in the Civil War who burned Atlanta. And his article wrote about how General Sherman is experiencing a comeback in town. Quoted people saying that he actually had many fine qualities. Danny had a sense of the irony and that sometimes conventional wisdom does not work. In 1998, he wrote a story. Now that's 21 years ago. It is almost a timeless story, and the headline is as follows: Netanyahu, his support eroding, calls for early elections. That story could be cycled regularly. In January 2002, in Pakistan, he wrote about smuggling. And I thought, as I was reading these stories, that line from the earthquake story, come closer, you can see the hand. In many ways, that is the purpose of journalism. I was talking to a Republican senator recently and expressing my concern about the news media, that we needed to look at ourselves with increasing clarity in the Trump era. And the senator said, you shouldn't worry about your business anymore. Most people have written journalism off as another form of politics. Now think about that. We have become, in many ways, and I think the senator was right, another form of politics. We need to look at our own house. We are under siege from Trump, I believe, and I could prove unfairly, but we cannot get in a defensive posture. We have to drain the emotions out of what's going on and take the Danny Pearl lesson, go back to the reporting and bring people closer and closer. When I was working on my fourth book on Bush's wars, George W. Bush's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a 4-star general who would not talk to me. I sent messages, emails, phone calls, intermediaries, nothing. Radio silence. I decided and realized I'd become lazy and was not going in the Watergate style of knocking on doors of homes when there was no appointment. So you are going to see a 4-star general. I had his address. When would you go knock on his door, Cal?
First thing in the morning?
First thing in the morning. Stick to the Burkle Center. First of all, first thing in the morning, the general is out doing PT, so he'll look like a colonel. You never want to go in the morning. You never want to go on Monday. Don't want to go on the end of the week. The best time to go is 8:17 on a Tuesday. 8:15 is okay also. But you want, why? Because you want to go there. If the general's home, he will have had dinner. Maybe have had a few pops. So I go knock on his door. He opened the door, looked at me, and he said, "Are you still doing this shit?" And I've learned from people in the CIA, it's very important to let the silence suck out the truth. And so I stood there poker-faced, and the general looked at me. I responded not at all. I have a little technique of sticking this finger over my little finger and jamming it into the fingernail so it hurts, and it is a memory aid that tells me, shut the fuck up. It's hard. And so after a few moments, the general looked at me and said, "Okay, come on in." Sat for 2 hours and answered questions. Why? Because somebody showed up. We're not showing up like real journalists do, like Danny Pearl did. Go to the scene. And reporters time and time again are trying to do interviews on the internet or on the telephone. When I was working on my book on Trump, Fear, I again realized this laziness had overtaken my method, and I would have people for dinner, or I would go to the offices, and you have to get into people's homes. And one night at 11 o'clock, I had the phone number of an important White House person, his home number. And I remember sitting there, and okay, I've got the number, I should make the call. And it was one of those fork in the road moments about, do I really do this? It's 11 o'clock at night. I was 74 years old at that time. I'm thinking, go to bed. But out of just the momentum, I made the call, and he answered, and I said, I'd like to do an interview about Trump. And he said, yeah, call the office tomorrow, the brush off. And I said, how about now? And he said, now? It's 11 o'clock at night. Are you crazy? And I said, well, I'm only 4 minutes from your home. And he said, 4 minutes from my home? How do you know where I live? And I said, I have good research. And he said, okay, come on by for a few minutes. So at 11:04, I showed up at his house. Luck, his wife was not there, and we talked, and it was not dawn when I left, but it was almost dawn. You need to go see people and you need to say, I want to understand what's going on. Richard Nixon once said, the problem with journalists is they look in the mirror when they should be looking out the window. It's one thing Nixon said that I agree with very much. We need to step back from the political food fight going on in America and do the reporting. Katharine Graham, the great publisher and owner of the Washington Post during Watergate, she wrote Carl Bernstein and myself a letter after Nixon resigned. And in her memoir, it was a private letter, but in her memoir, she disclosed the details of this private letter. As you know, you can never trust publishers. And she said, okay, you guys wrote some of the stories. Nixon's gone. Now, don't start thinking too highly of yourselves. Let me give you some advice, she said. Beware the demon pomposity. The demon pomposity. It stalks the halls in the media, in politics, in business, in academia, everywhere. And it does not work. The smugness and the self-certainty, people, wherever they are on the political spectrum, and they see it and they say, somebody's speaking with too much certainty about things that are not certain. Marty Baron, who is now the editor of the Washington Post, came from the Boston Globe, where he did the reporting for the movie Spotlight about Catholic priests and who were sexual predators. Marty Baron recently said that reporters need to display modesty and humility. We need to demonstrate to people that we're being fair. And you know, you can look at a story or you can watch something on television and you know, is that, it can be tough, it can be aggressive, but it also can be fair. And Marty said, when we've done our work, we need to tell people what we have found. As he said, quote, without masking our findings or muddling them, that we need to proceed in a way that builds confidence rather than destroys confidence. How many people here have seen the Robin Williams movie Dead Poets Society? Raise, my God. The residuals must be something on that movie. And it's Robin Williams plays a renegade teacher at a boys' prep school, and he's always causing trouble. And at one point in the movie, he gets up on the desk and stands there, and all the boys are sitting there in coats and ties, and you know, what the hell's going on? And Robin Williams says, I stand on my desk to remind myself that I need to find new ways to think about things. And I think there is a powerful lesson in all professions, politics, the media, business. We need to find new ways to do things. And in the Trump era, the accusations of fake news, what's so interesting is you look at our profession, the media, and you make a discovery along the way, and that is the barriers to doing your job are within ourselves. It's not what Trump says about us or what he does. It is the barriers that we erect within ourselves, and I think get into this mode of, oh my goodness, we're beleaguered rather than just doing the job. Danny Pearl saw naturally the way to do it, and his memory is a blessing to his family, to all of us, and to journalism. Come closer. Come closer. A great and hopefully a lasting motto that we can learn from him. The great novelist Graham Greene once said, "Do not despise your enemies or the people who disagree with you. They have a case." And that is true. And if the political leaders in our country can't find a way to throttle back the emotions and the divisiveness and the intensity, I believe that journalists must, and that we will, and for the rest of my life, I will remember that idea from Danny. Come closer. Come closer. Thank you very much. Now the waterboarding begins. We have water. Do we have a board?
We don't.
No,
we don't.
Okay.
I want to thank you so much for coming here, for talking with us, and for giving us your insights and wisdom. I want to start by asking a little bit about journalism. You've mentioned elsewhere, and you alluded to this in your remarks, about a war on truth that we're facing in this moment.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether you think that there's a heightened standard for journalists in this current climate to be accurate, to go deeper in the way that you talked about. Do we expect more? Should we expect more?
Well, we should expect more, and look, we make mistakes, but my observation and experience is that journalists do their work in good faith, by and large, and not always, and if there are mistakes, we need to own up to it, but you know, the ball's in the court of Trump, the president, and I have thought about this for many years, trying to write about and understand 9 presidents, and that is, what's the job? What's the job definition? If you go for a new job, like you're
I'm
not
going to answer another question.
you're not going to be.
That didn't go well.
You're not going to be a journalist, I know, because imagine showing up at the general's house in the morning. You might get shot.
Staying right here.
Yes, really, it's not safe. But what's the job of the president? And to me, the job of the president is to figure out what the next stage of good is for a majority of people in the country, a real majority, not a party, not a base, not a bunch of interlocking people who represent interest groups, but a real majority. We can do it on the board here. And then the president has to find some sort of way to develop a strategy to get there. And as best I can tell, in 2 years of working on Trump, and this is not partisan, this is empirical, that idea of the best stage, next stage of good for a majority of the people never comes up. And that is the real tragedy of the Trump presidency at this point, that so much good that can be done in an era of relative peace where the economy seems to be going along, but instead we have all of these skirmishes and these impulses, and I worry that after 2 years we have gone to sleep about the risk of the Trump presidency, because I've seen this. I've had the luxury of time to find out what really happened and what was said from notes and documents and diaries. And just take North Korea. I think that's the thing we should worry about the most. And that Trump, as you may recall, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, criticized Trump, and Kim Jong-un said he had a nuclear button. And so Trump responded like an adult and said, well, my nuclear button is bigger than yours. And then Trump realized that North Korea had lots of nuclear weapons, that they had mobile missile launchers from China, and that there's no way we can take them out in a preemptive strike. So he agreed to have last year a summit with Kim Jong-un, and then one this year. And the one last year was, oh, well, we're going to get them to get rid of their nuclear weapons. And that's a fantasy, because those nuclear weapons are the stature and leverage for North Korea. So I don't mean to get off on this, but we are in a bad situation with North Korea because the summit this year fell apart. Kim Jong-un stiffed Donald Trump, and if you learn one thing from Trump, don't stiff him, because he'll get payback. And there are people in the White House and Trump's circle goading him and saying, well, you solved this problem with some sort of war. And believe me, wars do not solve problems, they create problems.
Let me follow on that. In other remarks, you've characterized him as a gambler and said that he's gambling with North Korea, he's gambling with China. What do you think he's gambling for in these? I mean, these are varied cases, and I'll add Russia.
Yeah.
What is he seeking?
Well, he's gambling for what he thinks he wants, some sort of accomplishment, some sort of triumph. But we've got to understand the psychology of Trump, and I make no pretext at fully comprehending. But how many people here in the room have been elected President of the United States? None. But Trump was. And Trump was, contrary to all the wisdom of Washington, of Republicans, Democrats, and he got there himself. So he's received a self-validation that none of us receive in our lives. He got there, he did it, and so he is full of himself. He's got a big ego, and I think all presidents are isolated. They don't really get the truth from people. I've talked to cabinet officers in all 9 presidencies, and they'll say, boy, I'm going to go lay it on the line to the president. And then they get there and they melt and they fade. And it was George Kennan who called this is the treacherous curtain of deference that just falls, and people will defer to the president in a way. And so the president is not getting the full story. And I think Trump is the most isolated of all the presidents I've written about and tried to understand.
I want to ask you about comparisons to other presidents, because you probably know more about power in Washington than anyone alive. You have spoken with people at every level for decades.
But that speaking to people doesn't mean I know more than anyone. Believe me, I don't know more than anyone. I'm still kind of, look, I mean, you can tell, I'm worried. I am worried that there will be a miscalculation, these impulses, and talked to somebody in the CIA some time ago. I said, well, what do you think of the world? And they said, well, let's see, there are about 20 countries where the fuse of instability is lit. And I asked somebody else in the intelligence world, and they said, 20, actually that's a low number. It is a very dangerous world with a leader who does not think strategically and has no planning process.
Would you compare him in the way he exercises his presidency to anyone else that you've witnessed, or is he wholly unprecedented?
Well, he's got elements of other presidents. I mean, one of the things in the book, it shows that people who
Fear.
work for him
In
in the,
fear.
pardon?
When you say the book, fear.
In fear, that people who work for him steal documents off his desk because they're afraid he'll order up something, that he'll sign the document and trigger some sort of war or some sort of calamity. And the specific example involving South Korea. And I actually print the letter that Gary Cohn, who is the chief economic advisor, former president of Goldman Sachs, took from the Resolute desk, and it has the folder that Cohen put it in. And when the book came out, Trump said, "Oh no, that never happened. I would have fired Gary Cohn if that were true." And of course, the document itself is reprinted on page 9. But Trump did not get that far in the book. And it's a shame. It's a shame. And, this is the whole, what's true and what's real. And
Let me pivot to the book, and then we'll
Yeah.
move to questions from the audience. So first of all, I want to say it's a great book, and I recommend it. There's a lot that's interesting, a lot that's scary. One of the things that you talk about at some length, which is very interesting right now, is the discussion or the discussions that took place between some of Trump's lawyers and the Mueller team. And you detail the ways in which they interacted about what he might do or say. And so now that we have the report at least out, not fully out, would you be willing to prognosticate a little bit about what you think is going through, what you think might happen, and what you think is going through Trump's mind about it?
on the question of what's going through Trump's mind, easier to describe the creation of the universe. And yes, right, and that's hard, right, Professor Pearl? Yes, but what I show in the book is his lawyer for 8 months last year, John Dowd, big believer in Trump, worked closely for those 8 months with Trump, how to deal with Mueller's investigation. Mueller wanted to interview Trump, and they did practice sessions. And in the practice sessions between Trump and his lawyer, John Dowd, Trump would lie, he would make things up, he would say he didn't remember, he would, in other words, it was Trump being Trump. And Dowd said, I can't let you testify. If you do, you'll lie and wind up in an orange jumpsuit. And to emphasize his point, when Trump said no, he's going to testify to Mueller, Dowd resigned. But the last line of the book is Dowd's conclusion about Trump's problem, and he is a supporter of Trump. He's somebody who believes in him. And he didn't want to insult Trump and tell him what he thought, but what he thought was Trump's problem is you're a fucking liar. Now, that's Trump's own lawyer. That's not Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer saying that. It is his own lawyer concluding that. And that is a real dilemma. I think there are other things in the book, in the notes, where they meet National Security Council, and Trump is on some sort of jihad about all the money we're spending in military alliances with NATO in particular. And he said, we're paying for the military for Germany and so forth. Why are we doing that? We're suckers. If we were smart, we'd be rich. And finally, Secretary of Defense Mattis says to Trump, Mr. President, we're doing these things to prevent World War III. Now, I think job one of the President of the United States is to prevent World War III. That and this is a meeting 1 year into the Trump presidency, that the Secretary of Defense has to remind the president of what this job is chilling and frightening.
I mean, you recount an instance where Rex Tillerson, this was out in the press widely, calls him a moron, and it sounds like within earshot. Is that right?
No, it's not. It's after Trump leaves the
Trump
meeting,
leaves.
and you're laundering
Sorry.
a fucking moron. Okay, it's an academic environment, and we really.
You're on a roll. I wasn't going to stop.
Free speech. Okay.